Hi, my name's Bill Schaeffer, and this is another true UFO story. This is the first time I saw a UFO, and I was unaware of it until years later when I saw a second object and started researching the phenomenon. This happened in 1999 at the Burning Man Arts Festival in Black Rock City, Nevada. If you're familiar with Burning Man, it's an outdoor arts festival in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert, where artists go to camp and build constructions and generally act creative away from the confines of ordinary society. It's a lot of fun, and I highly suggest you attend. However, this experience is unrelated to Burning Man, other than that this is where it happened. It was the second to last night, I believe a Friday night. I had gone that year with my friend Chuck Shanks. And Chuck, surprisingly, being an expert woodsman, did not bring any long pants. This still baffles me to this day. It was freezing cold every single night, and Chuck was back at camp. Now the burn, I believe, was scheduled for Saturday night, and that's when they burn a huge effigy of a man. The night before was advertised in one of the theme camps a outer space fashion show or a futuristic fashion show or something like that, and the performance was slated for midnight. I had nothing else to do, so I decided that that would be a fun thing to see what they were doing. Now that year there were about 35,000 people at Burning Man, and the camp was arranged in a huge horseshoe that was several miles across. Imagine curving arc streets in the shape of a horseshoe where everyone camps, and the Burning Man is right in the center, the origin of the circle, and the prongs extend past the Burning Man. Now we were on the left-hand side, looking down, camped almost near the end of the prong. And this arts show, this performance, was on the exact total opposite end of the camp. That year I had borrowed a bicycle from a friend Scotty, who's a prop master. I asked for a junker bike, and he gave me an antique bicycle instead. I rode the bicycle out and got to where the performance was slated to be just before showtime, which was around midnight. Now, the performance was long and slow and pretty lame. And it went on for an hour and a half, and I hardly remember any of it, except it took place on an elevated gangplank or gangwalk, and at the one end of the set, there was this large mechanical flower, some kind of large mechanical lotus that was maybe 8 or 10 feet tall. And the theme of the whole show was at some point the lotus was going to open and reveal a mystery to all of us. So we stayed and watched and watched and watched. And nothing about the show I remember as being very remarkable, except for I was curious what was in this lotus, what would be revealed. Finally, after an hour and a half of interminable dialogue and slow parade of models wearing supposedly futuristic outfits, the lotus flower was opened, and there was nothing inside of it. This was very anticlimactic. So it was at this time about 1:30 in the morning, and I was cold, it was freezing cold, and I started looking for my bicycle, and it was gone. There were racks and racks of bicycles that were leaned up against the perimeter of the camp, and my bicycle was nowhere to be found. This is highly unusual for Burning Man because it typically was a pretty honest environment with no littering, where people were generous and thoughtful and fun-loving. And I was astounded that the bicycle was missing. I searched for half an hour. I looked everywhere I could, and I could not find the bicycle anywhere. Finally, around 2 in the morning, I decided that I must walk back to my camp. And instead of walking all the way around the perimeter of this horseshoe, I decided I would walk straight across the dark, abandoned desert between the two prongs. And I could see on the opposite horizon a faint line of lights that was the camp where our camp was to be found. So I just started walking across the desert. And as I say, it was freezing cold, it was pitch dark, there was no one out there. And this was a walk that was about 2 miles or so, because there were 35,000 people in this camp and it was several miles across. And it was at least 2 miles between the prongs. And the camp made a faint row of lights on the horizon. Now, at some point, walking along, I saw a pool of light up ahead. And I thought it was some people just out having fun in the middle of the darkness, in the middle of the desert. Now, if you're familiar with Burning Man, people dress up in wild costumes. A lot of people are partially naked with body painting. It's a very creative, expressive environment. And nothing is particularly surprising, because the people that go there are highly intelligent, highly creative, and very free and liberal. Now, as I'm walking across the desert, it's pitch dark, and it's cold, and it's past 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm tired. And I haven't been drinking all night. I, am just a little bit tired. And I see up ahead of me, in the middle of the blackness of the desert, a pool of light with some figures standing there. So as I approach it, I decide to see what they're doing as a diversion on the long, boring walk back to my camp. As I get closer, I see that there's 2 figures who are all bundled up in hats and scarves and glasses with flashlights. And they are illuminating another figure that is on the ground in all fours. And there's another figure standing there. And the person on the ground is a beautiful young girl. She's on all fours and she's absolutely naked, totally naked. Not a stitch of clothing. Naturally, this is kind of interesting, especially since she was extremely attractive and had flawless white skin. As I remember, just beautiful, flawless skin with long blonde hair, kind of strawberry blonde hair, on all fours and just about motionless. So I get out my flashlight and decide to add some light to the situation as I watch to see what's going on. And nothing was going on. Standing beside me were 2 guys that were all bundled up with goggles and scarf and hats and coats and gloves, and they were illuminating this girl with their flashlights. And standing beside this girl was a kind of a Svengali looking guy. As I remember it, he had dark hair, long hair, and an extremely manicured beard. And he was wearing some coat that was vaguely reminiscent of a pirate coat. It had big cuffs and long tails, and he had a riding crop in his hand. And he was just gently touching the head of this naked girl. And she was kind of slowly moving her head around the tip of the riding crop. And they were like in a very slow dance or movement of some kind, or performance. And I thought, wow, this is a strange performance in the middle of the desert. What's going on? And I don't even remember if the guy acknowledged my presence or not, but I'm standing there with the flashlight, admiring from the back the beauty of this young girl and wondering exactly what they're doing. And it's freezing cold. I'm all bundled up. It's freezing cold. And she's totally naked and doesn't seem to be cold at all. And after a little bit of this, the guy next to me nudges me like this. And he just silently points straight up. And I look up, and directly overhead is an astounding construction. And I think to myself, wow, someone has really gone all out. Because what it was, what it appeared to me, what I first thought it was some type of circular device. and I thought maybe it was 10 or 15 feet across, about 150 feet in the air. And it had a ring of lights around it. But on the underside, there were 2 panels of grids of blinking red LEDs. That's what they look like to me. And it was like 7 across, 9 down, and 2 of them just side by side formed these 2 panels of LEDs that were just blinking. Blink, 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 blink. Now, I had done some preliminary LED constructions, and I thought, wow, this is really fancy. This looks cool. And I just assumed, because a lot of the people at Burning Man build these fabulous constructions, I just assumed that someone had built some type of flying, floating device and tethered it up there in the middle of the desert. And after looking at the blinking lights for a while, I realized there was a beautiful naked girl down here, and she was much more interesting than this shape, this object in the sky. So I'm watching her a little bit more, wondering what's going to go on, what's going to happen, and nothing happened. They just stood and she totally ignored me because her head was facing away from me. But I could kind of see the side of her face, and she was absolutely beautiful. In perfect shape, with flawless skin, with no tattoos, with no marks, no shoes even, barefoot even, and no sign of clothes anywhere around. Like no sign that she had taken her clothes off. It was like she had walked all the way out in the middle of the desert there naked. And the Svengali guy kept on slowly touching her head with this riding crop, and they were in some extremely slow dance, self-absorbed dance. So I have my light on her, and I'm watching her for a while, and I look back up, and this object is still in the sky directly overhead. It's directly overhead, and it's absolutely motionless, like it's tethered there, like it's fixed to the sky, like it's hung from the sky. It's not floating, it's not wobbling, and again, I thought it was about 150 feet in the air. I thought it was about 10 or 15 foot wide, and something that someone had brought up to Burning Man. And so for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I don't even know how long, I watched this girl, and then I looked up, and this ship was still up there, hanging in the sky, motionless. And I don't know, I must have been there for 20 minutes or half an hour, and finally I thought, well, that's kind of cool, but it's late, I'm tired, and I've got to get back to camp. So I just left them there in the desert and continued on towards the thin row of lights on the horizon back to my camp. And just before I got back to my camp, there was a big bonfire where some young hippie kids were all telling off-color jokes, and I watched them for a while, and it was kind of funny. But then I went back to camp. And if I had a camera with me, by this time the batteries were dead. I don't even remember, and I didn't even try and take a picture or videotape any of the proceedings. And I just thought, that's curious. Another Burning Man experience. And I didn't think about anything about it until 2007, when I saw a black triangle in Los Angeles, Santa Monica. And when I started researching on the internet, I found a videotape of this craft that I had seen. And then that made me realize that it was probably not a special effects art construction or some robot flying machine, for several reasons. First off, it was in the middle of the desert. So there was no sign that it was tethered to anything. There were no ropes to the ground. There was nothing to hang it from. And it didn't wobble or bobble in the sky. It was locked, like it was fixed on a pole directly above us, just locked in place. Another thing that was peculiar, it occurred to me later on that I didn't really think about, was as I was walking across the desert, and even when I was a mile away, I did not see this object in the sky at all. All I saw was the faint pool of light with the figures on the ground. So it had to have been way higher in the sky than 150 feet. It had to have been so high in the sky that I did not even notice it up there until I was directly underneath it, and the gentleman next to me motioned for me to look up at it because I had no idea it was up there. And I was not drinking or doing anything else at the time. I'd been away from camp for 4 or 5 hours and was pretty much just tired, sober and tired. Now, the other last strange thing about it is these two gentlemen that were beside me were absolutely and totally covered. I could not see any inch of skin on them at all. They wore goggles and a hat, and they had gloves on and a coat and a scarf around their face. So it's very possible they weren't even human, and I would not have even known it, although they were both about my size. And they were totally silent and said nothing to me. Now, in the comments for this YouTube video, I'll leave the address, the web address of the other YouTube video where we see a video of this ship. And it was at the same Burning Man festival, because at the beginning of the video you can see that lotus flower that's partially opened or unopened in the corner of the frame. It was a big, like, tubular steel construction with some mesh across the leaves or the petals of the flower, some fabric across the tubular steel construction. And when you look at that and you see that flashing red UFO that's in the distance, I was standing directly underneath it. And I have no idea what it was or who those people were. No one said a thing. And because Burning Man is kind of a respectful place, we just kind of take things as they are without intruding or commenting or making comments, and we just witness the performance. And that is my Burning Man UFO experience. And there's no way that craft was built by someone at the Burning Man. Because if they had gone to that trouble to build something that complicated, they would have wanted people to see it. And they would have been flying it over the most crowded and populated portions of Burning Man, instead of leaving it hovering motionless in the desert where no one saw it, because it was very involved. Also, if it was higher than 150 feet in the air, so high that I did not even notice it even when I was a mile away, then it must have been huge. And it must have been much bigger than 10 feet across, maybe 100 feet across. And those weren't LEDs, they were some other big red flashing lights, arranged in a grid on the underside. And the last and most peculiar thing about the experience, aside from the silent, naked, beautiful girl on the ground, was that the craft was absolutely motionless, like it was fixed on the top of a long pole. But it wasn't tethered to the ground. And there's no way that you can get a radio-controlled craft to hover perfectly in space. You can't even do it with a helicopter with a person in it. And this was absolutely silent. It was making no noise at all, which is why I thought it was an art construction hanging from a balloon, but there were no tethers tethering it to the ground. And as I walked away, I didn't even look back and look up to see what it was, because it was the Burning Man, and I had just assumed that it was some special effects guy that had made a unique robotic art construction and hung it in the sky. And it was so late and it was so tired that I didn't even think twice about it. But that's my Burning Man UFO story. And I now believe that I really did see some kind of round, flashing, circular UFO. And I was there. And when you look at that other footage, below that UFO was one of the most beautiful, tall, thin, strawberry blonde haired with long straight hair and flawless skin naked women I'd ever seen in my life. And to this day I have no idea what it means, but it was a remarkable experience. Thank you, and leave your comments below.